There's just a slide that says Victoria Planning Commission, May 5th,
good.
2020.
I'm there. Fine. Thank you. Don't want to miss it.
Okay, we're good to go.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's Planning Commission meeting. I'm Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Victoria. While the doors to City Hall remain temporarily closed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to make sure that our public meetings continue in an open and transparent manner. State statutes allow the city to conduct public meetings by telephone, and the Victoria City Council has taken action to allow council and commission meetings to temporarily take place remotely during this pandemic emergency. As a result, we have some minor adjustments to the way we are conducting our planning commission meetings. During meetings that include a public hearing, members of the public wishing to speak will be able to do so via conference call, which will be noticed prior to the meeting. Tonight's meeting does not include any public hearings, so there's no dial-in number available. During meetings that do not have a public hearing, comments should be sent to the Planning Commission electronically prior to the meeting via email or using our online form. That form can be found at victoria.civicweb.net/portal under the meeting participation heading. Again, that is victoria.civicweb.net/portal. You can also email Senior Planner Paul Moretto at pmoretto@ci.victoria.mn.us. That is pmoretto@ci.victoria.mn.us. For those watching live or on MediaCom Channel 8, please be aware of the following. We do have a quorum of the Planning Commission that are here participating in this meeting remotely tonight. We are broadcasting the meeting live and are recording it so it can be viewed on demand later. There is up to a 1-minute delay from the live meeting to the online cable broadcast. And finally, all actions of the Planning Commission will be taken by a roll call vote. Thank you for your patience as we continue working through these remote and virtual meetings during this unprecedented time. And thank you for any constructive feedback that you have for these meetings as well. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Chair. Chair, I think you are muted.
You mean I got to start all over? Sorry about that. I will now call this meeting to order. The Victoria Planning Commission dated May 5th, 2020. First order of business tonight is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Members of the Planning Commission, before I ask for a motion, please state your name when moving and seconding. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
Commissioner Kuhn moves to adopt the final agenda.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Commissioner Iverson for a second.
Thank you. I have a motion made by Commissioner Kuhn, seconded by Commissioner Iverson. I will now take roll call vote. Commissioner Kuhn.
Aye.
Commissioner Gar.
Aye.
Commissioner Iverson.
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarting.
Aye.
Commissioner Pedersen.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries. Next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our April 21, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Members of the Planning Commission, again, before I ask for a motion, please state your name when moving and seconding. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Gar motions to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Commissioner Iverson, second.
I have a motion made by Commissioner Gar, seconded by Commissioner Iverson. I will now take roll call. Commissioner Kuhn,
Aye.
Commissioner Gar,
Aye.
Commissioner Iverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer. Aye. Commissioner Swarting.
Aye.
Commissioner Pedersen.
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries. We're now going to move on to our discussion items. Commissioners, reminder, please mute your microphones during these presentations when you are not speaking to avoid background noise. Thank you. We have one item on our agenda for discussion tonight, and it is item 3.1, Shoreland Management Ordinance Discussion. For those watching or listening to this meeting at home, please note there is no action being taken on this item tonight. This is another round of presentation and discussion on the city's shoreland regulations as we look to updating our existing shoreland management ordinance. Commissioners, as always with our virtual meetings, to help reduce the instances of us talking over one another, I'd ask that you please keep track of your questions during the presentation, and I will ask for them when prompted. I will now turn things over to Senior Planner Paul Moretto and Community and Economic Development Director Marty Dahl for staff presentation. Paul, Marty.
Chair, Commission, thank you. Today we're going to be reviewing and looking at updates to our shoreline management ordinance. Throughout this presentation, we'll be having both some discussion and dialogue, as well as some general overview of different parts of this shoreline management ordinance, to include what we currently have in addition to what we are proposing. So with that, I will begin. The shoreline management ordinance regulates a large portion of the city of Victoria. On the current slide, you'll see that there's a number of lakes that are described. These lakes are found both in the city of Victoria. A few are also located within our annexation area for our 2040 comprehensive plan. It's important to note that this shoreline ordinance regulates not just properties that touch the water of lakes, tributaries, and rivers, but it also affects properties within 1,000 feet of those lakes. These properties are often referred to as non-riparian. Those properties are located on the lake are considered riparian. So those are some key terminology to consider when we look at the balance of this presentation. Again, if you look at the slide in front of you, we do have a number of lakes. We have lakes that are defined as either general development lakes, such as Lake Minnetonka. We have recreational development lakes, which take up a large portion of lakes, such as Lake Minnewaska, Schutz Lake, Virginia. We also have natural environment lakes. These are smaller in nature, usually a little more shallow. You might know such lakes as Marsh Lake or Tamarack, Lake Tamarack. So keep those type of concepts in mind when we're looking at these lakes and definitions. Next slide, please. Well, one of our key partners within the shoreline management is the DNR, or the Department of Natural Resources. They have jurisdiction over public waters, and they also have review authority over developments within the shoreland. One of the main purposes of this revision is to make sure that our shoreline management ordinance more closely aligns with the DNR model, which is also based off of state statutes. If you can remember back to a meeting or two ago, we had our friends at the DNR give a presentation over Shoreland 101 basics, and those key concepts are critical to our review and update. And one thing that we want to look at is the DNR provides both more stringent as well as more flexible options within our code, or within their what we consider to be their baseline codes, model ordinances, I guess you could call it. And what we're looking to do is include flexibility of our request to better reflect local community desires and developments. So these are some important concepts when reviewing and what we're looking to make changes to. Next slide, please. I just want to provide a little bit of context and and the process that we've engaged in. We'll start with a little bit of history. We've started looking at this Shoreland Management Ordinance update pre-2017 when we had some requests for trying to figure out how we can streamline our process between ourselves and the DNR. In 2017, the city worked with HKGI, a contract planner and consultant planner, to help do research on the project. In 2018, the city submitted worksheets of potential changes to the DNR. These included both increased regulation as well as increased flexibility, and the DNR was generally receptive to those proposals. In 2019, the city paused the process just to kind of regather the process and to try to find a new heading as we had some staffing changes. In 2020, this year, staff re-engaged with the process to update this with the DNR. This process was brought in-house with coordination with the City Council, Planning Commission, and our Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee. And it's important to know that, you know, we want to make sure to give this ordinance a Victoria first and Victoria-centric pattern and philosophy, so that we make sure it fits the community of Victoria. Next slide, please. So currently, staff is redlining the DNR model ordinance. This has been an ongoing process, and it's been very involved and very deep. It's things that we're looking at basically line by line, verse by verse of the DNR model ordinance, and then comparing it to our own ordinance. We're now engaging with you as the Planning Commission to have a public hearing on the proposed ordinance around June 2nd of 2020. For tonight's meeting, we wish to discuss the broad shoreline management policies, proposed changes and revisions, and current city ordinance, and with regard to flexibility requests and other types of requests. The feedback received at the meeting will inform revisions and discussion with the DNR, which will be happening shortly. Also, our Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee will also be reviewing this, as that's one of their tenant goals for this year, and they will be providing detailed feedback to the Planning Commission. And again, this is a collaborative, iterative process. You'll see it today as a first discussion piece and to have that feedback, but it'll continue into meetings in the future, so please keep that in mind. So as we think about how we want to move forward, let's first consider a question, which is, what are the priorities for the City of Victoria as it relates to managing natural resources and development within the shoreland? And again, feel free to engage in discussion and conversation, because each one of these questions will build into the next question. And so with that, if I could have any responses to this particular question.
This is Sheriff Sensland. I know one of the things I heard from the meeting we shared with the Lakes and Water Quality group was a need to manage wastewater within all our lakes. I think that would be something that would be, you know, stormwater, wastewater, something that would be key.
Okay, very good.
This is Terry Schwarting. I think we want to preserve and improve the quality of our lakes.
Very good.
This is Commissioner Kuhn. Another thing we got to watch is probably the actual shoreline themselves, you know, as far as grass or trees, preserving natural resources along the shore would be a priority to help keep the water clean.
Excellent.
This is John Iverson. One of the other things that came up with the Clean Water Group, which I think should be very instrumental in this process at the same time. But one of them was the chemicals on the lawns for, you know, both fertilizer and weed control, and the problems that that does create. But I think limiting the size of the lots is a big thing that that we do want to maintain. So that will ultimately decrease the numbers of homes on the lake.
So regulating the size of the lot in terms of making sure there's density limits?
Density limits, yep, exactly, thank you.
This is Commissioner Carr. In my experience in the town I lived in Illinois, we had a great deal of lakes, and one of our most important requirements was it's not maintained lawn, i.e. not fertilized. It's just.
If I could have you repeat that point just
It's
one
a
more time, we
buffer.
cut out a little bit.
Should I start from the beginning again?
If that's possible, I think we cut out just a little bit.
Okay, the key thing is to have a natural setback, and by natural,
It sounds like a natural setback.
and it also is an area that is not landscaped or maintained with chemicals. So it helps keep the lakes cleaner.
Excellent. We could move to the next slide, perhaps. And so that was good feedback. Thank you. We want to continue that conversation by asking another question, which is what types of residential densities are acceptable in the shoreline, or what types should be acceptable in the shoreline areas? And when we think of that, I mean, you can think of in terms of just lot sizes. You can think in terms of unit types, whether it's 2-family, 3-family, multi-unit, setbacks, those sorts of things. So when thinking of that question, maybe you think of it in those terms.
Personally, I'll start. When I think of the shoreland areas and, for example, a PUD where you have a mix, maybe of some different housing types, personally, I see, you know, the riparian lots. I see a possibility for different types of homes in that district or area, but I would think riparian lots are primarily going to be single-family homes. Then as you get away from the non-riparian area lots, you know, I perceive the possibility for maybe some mixed use, maybe some townhomes, you know, carriage homes, whatever, you know, just a different mix of housing opportunities. But personally, I'd like to know what the other folks feel, but I think riparian lots really primarily should be single-family homes.
Commissioner Blazer, I agree with that point.
Yeah.
This Commissioner Iverson, I mean, that is exactly my thoughts on it at the same time. And without making it, maybe the term would be exclusive, but I think in order to maintain for, you know, for the future, you know, I think it's going to have to be, we're going to have it with exclusivity in mind at the same time.
I also like to just preface, remember when we think of the shoreland area and the shoreland ordinance, also think of that 1,000-foot setback as well, a 1,000-foot area around the lake that's also included within the shoreland.
Yeah, that was my thought when thinking about that 1,000-foot setback, because you're going to, in my mind anyways, where that would encompass some of those non-riparian lots, and that's where I think there's definitely opportunities for other housing mixes in there.
This is Commissioner Kuhn. I think you still got to keep an open mind to, mixed use. I mean, you look at the senior apartments that are down by, the Victoria House. I'm drawing a blank on the name, that are on that lake, and then you got the townhomes up off Lake Zumbra. When you're looking at the different types of homes that are going to need to be built for, future home densities, or even you get around the 13.5 acres, there's some of that mixed use you're going to need to keep it open, so it's not all single family housing either.
I think you're absolutely right. When I made my comment, in my mind, I'm thinking more along the lines of, and it doesn't have to be this anyways, but I'm thinking like the general development lakes, or the general lakes, like a Lake Minnetonka, Minnewaska. Then as you kind of move down into more, what was the third? Paul, there was the general, there was the developing. What was the third classification of the lakes?
Natural environment.
Natural environment. Certainly, when you get down into that natural environment, that's a good point, Jared. That makes me sort of rethink all that. I think it's sort of, different areas potentially could have, different, kind of housing needs and applicable sort of to the different types of lakes.
So it'd be fair to say that it's sort of context-based?
Could you just repeat that, Paul?
Would it be fair to say that it's context-based? So depending on the context of the area, it has certain needs or certain desires?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Jared, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds right. And again, if you have the natural barriers in between of it, it makes it more, you get the view of the lakes or access, but yeah, the contact part of it would be good.
Yeah, you sort of have those natural barriers built, right into that. And I think that would absolutely support, a higher density, whether it was, like you mentioned, something like we have downtown now with the apartments for the senior living, or, considering the 13.5 acres and opportunities that could go in there. That would fit real well within an area like that.
I have a question. Earlier you spoke about managing storm water as well as wastewater. Will all of our lakeside areas be serviceable by sewers, or will we have septic fields there in some areas where the sewers can't reach them? Do we have areas like that in our city? It can't be reached by sewers because they're too far away? It would be prohibitive.
Commissioners, this is Marty. I think we do have a few holdover properties existing within the city proper that are unsewered. I couldn't tell you offhand where or how many of those would be in shoreland areas, but I do believe there are some that are existing. One of the things, and we'll talk about it when we get a little further into the presentation, is that one of the proposals, and it's also based on DNR standards, is that you've got a different set of standards, lot size, width, when you're talking sewered or unsewered lots, depending on zoning. So, for example, in a future annexation area, if it was the city were to annex it and that area remained an ag zoned property, but was within the shoreland, there'd be potential to have an unsewered property, but it would need to be a very large lot. You wouldn't be able to come in and do subdivision on that until it is sewered. So I think we'll talk about that a little bit further into the presentation.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. This actually segues well into our next slide here, which is how should commercial development occur within a shoreland? And just a little bit of additional context, I think it's clear that downtown Victoria exists on a lake. But, I mean, if one ventures downtown, there's clearly a path and a trail that separates downtown from the lake. There's, green space. So there's a little bit of context for our downtown today. But as we look forward to, other spaces and other places throughout the city and an annexation area, as well as in downtown in general, how should commercial development occur within that shoreland?
I think the simple answer is with a lot of thought. I mean, I don't think it automatically prevents itself from development in shoreland, but I think it would definitely need some thought and discussion between with planning commission, city council, but I don't think it automatically is spurs a no that it can happen. I mean, I think, like you just said, Paul, I think downtown Victoria has shown that it's happened and it's been successful. I think it could continue to be that within our shoreland.
Commissioner Pedersen, if I remember correctly from the DNR presentation, there are height limits and limits based on the amount of footage from the actual from the water source to the building. So an example would be you could create an apartment-like complex with the second story being an apartment where the main level is an ice cream shop and an accounting firm. And I think something of that line, as long as it adheres to the DNR's standards, would be an acceptable situation in the right area. You're not going to just throw up something like that on Parley Lake, but maybe as the extension of downtown Victoria, it would definitely be something to consider.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
I would just think, this is Terry Schwarting, I would just think that the cost of shoreland would make commercial a little more difficult.
That's a good point.
But I wouldn't exclude it. I think it's the quality of the development.
This is Commissioner Pedersen again. I would also try to keep any sort of parking lot or parking structure further away than 1,000 feet from the water source as well. Again, I know the DNR has some restrictions on that and some rules and guidance, but I think that would be something that we would want to definitely take into consideration with the new ordinance.
Yeah, I think that would also, that would kind of follow with, non-pervious and stormwater, again, that all is going to fall into that. And again, I think that, it doesn't exclude it, but I think all those things would be considered into, any sort of commercial development within a shoreland.
So from a design standpoint, it sounds like if there are parking facility or structure, it should be rear loaded away from the lake.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, Commissioner Pedersen, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Sorry if I wasn't that clear.
Oh, no, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Excellent. We'll move on to the next question. So this one deals with how access is managed. So particularly, how should water access be managed both from a private property owner and the general public? So whether that be, a public access or whether it be private access, community access, maybe such as like that on Waterford Landing. Any thoughts on that particular subject?
This Commissioner Iverson, I would think that the size of the body of water would really be the determining factor. Many of the lakes that are listed are really relatively small, kind of neighborhood type lakes, and should remain as that rather than public access. Now, when you look at maybe Minnesota, that's a little bit larger, but it's pretty nice homes along the shoreline, and the people have a substantial investment in the home and the property at the same time. So I would want to restrict most of that type of thing to the smaller lakes, smaller bodies of water.
I was looking at the, this is Chair Stensland. I was looking at the DNR shoreland model ordinances, and they talk about the controlled access, within, like a PUD. So you would have a lot that would allow, the entire, all the landowners within that PUD to own a lot that they, non-riparian owners could have access to the lake through that. And I hadn't thought of that before. I know there are some instances of that on Lake Minnetonka where there are developments with water access. And frankly, I hadn't thought about how that will be managed. And it sounds like this is how it's probably done, leaving some lots within that development specifically for the non-riparian users. And, that's interesting to me. I think that's, again, I agree with John. I think it depends on the size of the lake, because we do have some, some of these are kind of smaller lakes, but I think that could potentially lead to a highly desirable development when you're, it's not just the few that live on the lake, but, potentially the rest of the development has access to it, or maybe a place to park a boat or store kayaks, something that recreation device that can get them out on the lake.
Paul or Alyssa, do you want to advance to the next slide, because that ties into this next slide specifically, and I'll just jump in on this just with a little more additional context. So that is actually, Chair, Commissioners, one of the specific questions that we were hoping to get a general thoughts or feedback on from the Commission. The DNR model ordinance calls out controlled access lots as optional language. Kind of basically saying that they'll allow it if a city wants it. If they don't want it, that's fine. Right now, our current ordinance is silent specifically on controlled access lots, though, as you probably know, we have allowed them through the PUD process in the past. One of the things staff has been considering or talking about that if it was something that the planning commission and the council were in favor of, at least allowing a mechanism that could allow them would be to make them a conditional use, so that if a developer or someone proposed a controlled access lot, it would then give you, just as you're saying, it would give you an opportunity to look at that, look at the lake, look at the character of the neighborhood, and determine whether or not that made sense in that specific area. But we are looking for kind of the planning commission's direction on whether or not you think controlled access lots are in general a good, bad, or neutral idea.
Well, you heard my thoughts. I think it's potentially a good idea. I think it's important that it would be under a conditional use so that we would have the opportunity to look at it before it's planned and see if it does fit, you know, the spirit of the PUD and the area and the development. But, you know, especially with the conditional use tied to it.
Commissioner
Any other
Pedersen,
thoughts?
I would absolutely agree with Scott. I would request that it be as minimally impactful to the area as possible, or keep it as natural as possible. You know, I was kind of leaning towards neutral, but I agree with Scott that I think it could be extremely beneficial for the folks within that particular area, which should be beneficial to all of Victoria.
I have a question. It's Commissioner Gar. The phrase, the highest and best use of the land, is that something that if we did not allow, say, a subdivision to have an area for lake access, could we be sued because we didn't allow them the best use of the land?
I'm no attorney. This is Paul. But I think if you have a well-vetted ordinance that puts limitations and restrictions on certain types of uses, you know, whether that's considered a taking or not, that has to be litigated. But I know in the past, like for example, we have our Waterford Landing development, and a trade was we allowed a controlled access lot in exchange for no riparian lots on that development. And so it's all, you know, HOA maintained outlot. And so whether or not we would necessarily ban outright all, you know, lake access, I mean, that's a big good question. I don't know if that's, you know, legal or not, but I think there are ways to architect an ordinance so that it's fair and it provides for the best and potential use of land without infringing on, you know, people's rights as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, Mary Jo, I think that's a great question. But I also think that, you know, just sort of going through the process, sort of vetting out new developments and, you know, and starting with preliminary plats and planning commission and, you know, the city council and final plats, I think that sort of, we sort of get there, you know, in the end, everybody, especially with the PUD, everybody seems happy, and we've made a lot of different choices along the way. And so by the time it gets to the end, personally, I feel like, you know, the highest and best use of the land is sort of been a give and take from both sides, and it's usually decided on at that point. Paul, would you agree with that, or?
I think so. I think, you know, there's a wisdom in the councils and commissions that provide for what that best and highest use is. For example, I mean, there's a potential that, you know, the highest economic value would be some sort of, like, you know, vulcanization plant, but that wouldn't make much sense in a shoreland area. So, you know, the planning commission and council use their wisdom to decide that's not appropriate, and instead a different plan is appropriate. And it may be that there's less impact on the shoreland is the best and highest use of that land. And that is why we engage in this public process.
Yeah, interesting question though.
this Commissioner Iverson, in looking at my my notes for the packet for this evening, one of the getting ahead of ourselves, one of the topics was the flex options, and I think this falls into that same category where we want to set the parameters, but be open to other possible options that come up in the process, and do that as required. But I really do think that for the, quite frankly, to protect our lakes, we really have to have some pretty tight parameters on what we do and what we allow. And again, that said, when it gets into some other flexible ideas, let's take a look at that also.
I agree.
Okay, well, thank you for that feedback. That was very informative. It'll help us in our process. Another question to consider is, has this become something that is fairly common in areas where we annex in, such as, lots on Lake Minnetonka back in the 60s and 70s, or whether we look towards other lakes that are in Lake Township, is how do we, or how should the city handle non-conforming lots of record with existing structures that'll be removed or nearly removed? There's a couple different options that are possible, whether they are allowed to be rebuilt or they're allowed to, or they have to be removed in general. So just looking for some feedback on this concept of lots of record and existing structures and them being removed or nearly removed.
And Paul or Alyssa, before Commissioner Sori, before you get into your discussion, if you can move to the next slide. We've outlined what our current city ordinance, the basic parameters for these tear down rebuilds of non-conforming lots of record. The reason we brought this one to your attention specifically and trying to get some feedback is because the DNR model ordinance has some protections for additions, and if a non-conforming home is destroyed by a fire or some sort of natural disaster type thing, that it can be rebuilt in its current location even though it is non-conforming. This is more specifically for someone who owns a property that is non-conforming, wants to tear down that property and build a new larger house per se, and whether or not our ordinance should allow them to continue that nonconformity, which it does currently. Our current ordinance does allow with this language, or whether or not it should be required to meet those standards of the shoreland setbacks if it is a purposeful tear down and rebuild.
Does that pass to a new owner or just stay with the original owner?
I think this would be in either circumstance. You mean the nonconformity? The nonconformity exists with all owners. However, the current owner could, based on our current ordinance, could tear down a nonconforming home or property and rebuild that maintains some semblance of nonconformity based on these requirements that are in our current ordinance.
As Terry Short, it would seem difficult to not continue to allow some nonconformity based on what's happened in the past.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
But try to make them conform.
Well, and just to clarify, this would be non-conformance is a non-conforming property as it sits is a legal non-conforming property. They wouldn't be required to do something different. It would be in the instance where a property owner wanted to tear down that non-conforming house to rebuild a new house, would or could or should they be allowed to maintain that non-conforming setback to build their new home?
This is Commissioner Pedersen. I've run into this quite a few times. I have a cabin in another part of the state, and I would say about 15 times per year, somebody wants to tear down their former residence or cabin and build something on the same footprint. From what has been allowed there, it was if you're not moving the foundation, you can build off of the foundation. If the foundation has to be touched, you have to conform to the new laws and the new statutes and the new ordinances. And it has been dramatic, to say the least. So I don't feel that I can go either way on it. I think we would need to have a lot of flexibility on it based on the situation. If you're near a water source that's considered extremely damaged, then maybe that place needs to conform to the new rules. If it's an area that's relatively clean and the water quality is good, maybe there's some flexibility. I guess I would just say from my experience, I would ask there to be a little bit of flexibility in there. And that's all. Thank you.
Well, let me ask, in this situation, so it's a new owner, they want to tear down a house and rebuild. Since it's in this district, it's going to be a conditional use. The rebuild's going to be however they do it, it's going to be a conditional use. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I think it would be permitted use based off of the nonconformity, because you're allowed to do certain building and rebuilding of nonconformities based on permitted uses. It's a little difficult to go through the weeds, but in this case, you probably will rebuild as is.
As is on the existing footprint.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think without a conditional use, I think then it needs to be tightened up a little bit in that circumstance. And whether, as Commissioner Pedersen mentioned, whether it's around using the existing footprint, so to speak. I think these new houses do need to conform, just like any other new house being built.
Well, I guess, yeah, one option is for them to engage in the variance process, which, would be a public process.
Yeah. Whether a variance or conditional use, somehow that, again, it comes in front of the Planning Commission, it comes in front of the City Council, so that we can, agree to the terms.
This is Commissioner Blazer. I agree there should be some flexibility and probably context dependent. So if it's a purposeful rebuild and the land or the property that it's on has the ability to have a structure there be conforming, I think it should be conforming.
So this is Marty again. So what I think I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong from the feedback, is that we should craft this draft in a way that doesn't make it an outright permitted use to be able to do this, which I would interpret our current ordinance does allow, but to make sure that it needs to be done through a variance process if someone wants to propose maintaining their non-conforming setbacks on a rebuild. Does that adequately summarize what we've kind of talked about here?
That summarizes my thoughts.
This is Commissioner Coon. I agree that it needs to be tightened up or redone. Just even, for hardcover issues, if it's, non-conforming in a hardcover and it's, and they're changing it, you get into these shoreline things, these areas, I don't know if we have a hardcover calc or, that's what a lot of the cities have gone to. But we should put something in there for something like that also.
Yeah, we currently have in the Shoreland ordinance in a shoreland district, it's 25% of a property is the maximum impervious surface allowed.
All right, I think that was good feedback. Let's move on to our next slide. This is a question that's near and dear to my heart as I deal with a lot of accessory structures and sometimes the ambiguity within the shoreline area. Well, the question is, how should the city handle accessory structures and water-oriented structures in the shoreland areas? And this can be a difficult question because shoreland is an overlay, so it goes on top of the regular zoning. For most of the homes in the city of Victoria, it's in the R1 or some sort of permutation of R1. And that allows for usually two accessory structures. Usually it's either a attached, detached, or a shed. In the shoreland area, particularly if you're a riparian lot or a lot on the water, you're allowed to have a accessory structure, such as a shed or some other like structure, and a water-oriented structure. And that's unique to activities that occur on the water. And so we're just looking for a little bit of feedback on that particular issue, whether it's setbacks, whether it's use of those water-oriented structures, whether it's a limit on the number, just some feedback on that sort of issue.
Well, I think you do have to have a limit on the number of water-oriented structures. Absolutely.
Should be a limit on size, how big these things can be, or?
Well, I think part of that is going to fall. It's going to have a. Well, I shouldn't. I'm envisioning in my mind a roof line, a roof, and so that's going to fall into the 25% impervious surface. So that, I mean, it has to fall under that. It can't, be out of guidelines with that. So that's going to somewhat limit size, how many.
Right.
But how close to the lake. I know with some of these existing structures, sometimes they're grandfathered in where you can rebuild, but it's got to be in the same area. But for new developments, I think definitely there needs to be, some setbacks from the shoreline. And I don't know, thoughts? What do other people think?
Chair, commissioners, this is Marty again, just for some additional context. So our current ordinance, which is actually consistent with the DNR's model ordinance on this, requires a 10-foot setback for a water-oriented accessory structure from the ordinary high water line. And then I believe the building square footage is limited to 200 square feet. Is that right, Paul? For a water-oriented?
Correct. I think there is a caveat that if it's based off of some sort of boat or of maintenance, you can go a little larger than that.
It can go up to 400. Yeah, I think that's correct. 200, but if it's used specifically to house a boat or a watercraft, it can go up to 400. And again, that is actually consistent with the DNR's model ordinance as well.
I believe it applies to the shoreland still. I have to double check, but I believe it's true that if you're in an R1 underlying zoning district, you can go up to 900 square feet of accessory structure that's not a water-oriented structure. In the LMR, or the Lake Minnetonka Residential District, there is no limit. It's not explicitly stated, so I mean, you can go much higher than that. You can, by CUP, increase your 900 square foot limit up to 50%.
Can you hear me? This is Commissioner Gar.
We can hear you.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I recall last year, didn't we have someone come for a variance so that they would be permitted to have restroom facilities in a building that was quite close to the lake? And that's something that we need to think about. Are we going to allow that sort of use? You're talking about a shed to keep a boat, but there are other things like how lovely to have a party house right down there, and you'd have restrooms. And is that what we want to permit?
Yeah, it's a good point. Probably not. I think we'd want to, especially if it is a water-oriented structure, we would potentially want to put some language around what acceptable uses are.
Well, then again, we're talking about keeping the lake clean too. It might be better to permit the facilities. Something to think about. In these days when we're watching about how we can wash our hands and other things.
Yeah, go talk to the folks at Big Island about that.
Yes, exactly.
One of the other items I'd like the Planning Commission to consider, and I think it's a bit ambiguous within our current code, as whether or not a water-oriented accessory structure counts is allowed in addition to a regular accessory structure that meets the normal accessory structure setbacks, size requirements, etc. As Paul was referring to, I think our accessory structure language in our ordinance says that a property can have two of the following three, either an attached garage, a detached garage, or a shed. So if you have an attached garage, you can have either one shed or one detached garage, essentially saying one additional accessory structure in that instance. So the question I would have and would like to get some feedback or thoughts from the commission is whether or not a water-oriented accessory structure that, again, 200-foot maximum closer to the water would be allowed in addition to, say, a detached garage or an additional shed that meets the regular accessory structure requirements.
Commissioner Stensland, my thought, I guess I do see especially for a riparian lot, to have a water-oriented accessory building down closer to the area is certainly a benefit. That particular homeowner still is probably going to have riding lawnmowers and things that we all need additional storage for sometimes. I guess I kind of go back to my earlier comment. I think, and maybe I'm wrong, Marty, but would you agree that some of that may get vetted out from the 25% impervious surface area? I mean, I know we've worked with a couple different homeowners over the years, with sheds and things, and it seemed to me at the time they weren't, asking for, huge outbuildings, but that impervious surface area usually is what catches things, kind of caught things,
right?
And had downsized buildings because of that. So maybe I'm just hopeful thinking, but my thought is maybe some of that gets caught, kind of vetting out that process.
I would agree that would be an acceptable approach to look at those types of things, to be able to allow that additional building, smaller water accessory structure, again, making sure it meets, that doesn't exceed that 25% impervious.
And that, I mean, that's one way to catch it. If you have a better way, or if anybody else, any other planning commissioners have a better way, I'm certainly open to hear those. But that was just my initial thought. That might kind of get caught up there, but maybe there's a better way.
I think you found the best way.
The crickets agree.
Someday look friend.
I think there's many different levels. I mean, if it's a, most, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but most of the new construction would be year-round home, and it would not be viewed as a secondary cabin type of a structure. So, I think there's I don't think we're in that geographical area for any of the structures to be to be viewed as cabins. They would be viewed as around homes. And with that, having a structure for the boat and having having an attached garage would be a natural.
Yeah.
Great.
Great, next slide. And I think this is, I'm going to hand it off to Marty to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thanks for helping lead us through that, some of those broader level discussions. So one of the things that we were hoping was going to come out of the previous discussion that we just had was that the commission was generally in line with some of the thoughts and ideas that we're going to propose here as potential changes and some of the flexibility requirements, which I think in general you are, which is good, because otherwise I would have been calling the meeting right now and we'd have gone back to the drawing board. But so I'm going to walk through just a few. We've got some slides. This first section is really some of the quote unquote significant changes that would be different from our current ordinance to what we're looking at and proposing as we're working through this red line. And again, looking for planning commission feedback on whether or not we're on the right track, or if there's any issues or concerns or different things you'd like staff to look at. And then once we've gone through those couple of slides, we've got a few more that talks about some of those flexibility requests that would actually be Victoria's requested changes to the DNR's model ordinance. So just keep that in mind as we're walking through this. This first section are differences between our current ordinance. The second section will be proposed flexibility requests from the DNR model ordinance. So the first slide we have here is the residential planned unit development. I think we talked a lot about earlier in this meeting that density is maybe not necessarily a bad thing, depending on the area, the character, if it is not necessarily right on the shoreline, and having some flexibility to be able to do some different things and have some different housing types in these areas. So one of the things that we are proposing is to have the residential plan unit development process be very prescribed. The DNR model ordinance actually has a formula that is used and outlined that we would propose adopting as part of our ordinance that allows you to calculate based on tiers from the shoreline and then outwards certain feet that are also prescribed in that ordinance, how much density can be in each of those tiers. So we would be suggesting or proposing to use that prescribed format for those PUDs. And then the next two pieces, in addition to allow a developer to have some increased density in a shoreland area, we'd be asking for two different things. One would be a dedicated public buffer area along the shoreline of 150 feet from the ordinary high water line, which gets to some of the feedback about protecting the actual shoreline area. In that instance, we would be asking the developer to actually deed as a public outlot 150 feet area from that water line to the property line as protected natural buffer, which would essentially create all of those lots as non-riparian. And then another give back from the developer in a situation where the city is saying you can have more density is to dedicate open space within that development of 25% of the entire development area. And in that scenario, the developer would be able to use that 150 feet area as part of that 25% calculation. So thoughts on that?
So that dedicated public buffer along the shoreline. So similar to what was done in the past few years on Lake Wasserman. So basically, if you were in the lake looking at that development at the houses, what you're seeing is trees along that entire shoreline, basically in everybody's backyards.
Correct. Same concept.
And now, and I'm just going to throw an example out there. Let's say Lake Pearson, one of the rural parts of Lake Pearson is not developed now. Let's just, look to the future. Let's say it's annexed into Victoria. Developer comes in, wants to build some lots there. That would be a requirement of building there, so there's no possibility of riparian lots? Or
No, Chair, Commissioner, this would be only using if a developer wanted to have increased density on that shoreline. So we'll get into some of the proposed setback and lot size for standard or straight shoreland development that would allow for riparian development. Again, I think, and we'll get into this, but we're proposing, some of the medium to larger size lots that give you that riparian. This would be if a developer came in and said they want smaller lots than what the straight shoreline zoning allows for. They want to be able to put in more houses, potentially, again, the townhomes or that situation that they can't meet the straight shoreline zoning depending on the lake classification, so they want to go the PUD route. This would be then required as part of the PUD.
Okay, I understand. Makes sense. I like it.
Any other questions, comments, feedback on this? Next slide, please. So another proposed change from our current ordinance. Again, I think we got some feedback early in the meeting that we need to have some flexibility within our commercial districts that are in a shoreland, specifically currently our downtown area, which is a commercial business district, as well as the 13.5 acres that need to be developed or that are on the precipice of being developed. Staff is proposing that we craft the updated ordinance in a way that allows commercial plan unit developments in any existing commercial, industrial, or mixed use areas, which again, in present day would only be our commercial business district, but could potentially be some other areas that would be zoned that way in the future, to be able to develop those using a master site plan that takes the intent of the ordinance when it comes to stormwater management, protection of natural areas, green space into the equation, but does not necessarily tie the city to strict development standards. It would essentially allow us to work with a developer, with the planning commission, with the city council to build a site plan or to build a development plan that meets the intent of that ordinance, that provides development that we as a city would prefer and is good for the city, and then be able to work through that process that way. I would imagine this is something that we would be proposing to the DNR as a flexibility request. So I imagine once we do that, we will have some additional feedback from them. I imagine one of their conditions to this would be that they would ultimately want to have review authority on some of these things. So that'd be something to consider too, that if we were to want to go this route, we would likely still need the DNR to have some review authority on that process to have them be comfortable. And I think as a city and wanting to protect our natural resources, I think we'd probably be open to that to make sure we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that would be a fair trade-off, and I think that the leadership of the city would certainly, in working with a developer on, say for example that 13.5 acres, I would hope we would get to a place where the DNR would agree with what we were doing. So I think that would, I don't want to say the least of our worries, but I would be confident that when we got to that point, I'm sure the DNR would approve what we were looking to do.
This is Commissioner Iverson. I think the phrase "the area and the character" is just really what should be stated, because here's the existing situation that we have to deal with, and that may not fall. That's where the whole flexibility comes into play. That may not conform to the absolute parameters, but I think that's where flexibility truly does become important. Again, on the 13.5 acre area, there's going to have to be some considerations to make that work.
Thank you. Any additional feedback on this item? All right, next slide, please. So this is, and we'll talk about this as well when we get into the flexibility, because some of these items are also flexibility items, but this table is specifically showing the proposed changes in lot sizes and lot width in shoreland areas. Some of these are to become more consistent with DNR model ordinance, and again, some of them are flexibility items. But as you look across the table, you can see what our current ordinance provides as far as square footage and lot width in feet in each of the natural environment areas for both, or each of the lake classifications for both riparian and non-riparian lots. So as you'll see, the current ordinance for natural environment riparian, we'd actually be requesting increasing the lot width from 125 feet to 150 feet. In the non-riparian lot areas, we're looking at reducing those from 20 to 15,000 and 125 feet to 80 feet. That would be more consistent with our R1 zoning. In recreational development lakes right now, we require an acre square footage and 125 feet lot width in the proposed ordinance. And again, this is consistent with the DNR model of 20,000 and 80, non-riparian from 20,000 to 15 and 125 to 80. And then the lot width of the general development riparians from 110 to 100, and the non-riparian lot area down from 21,780 to 20,000, and the lot width from 110 to 100. Those items noted in the recreational development and general development lake, the proposed changes are the current square footage and lot width areas that are in the DNR model ordinance.
Okay.
So thoughts and discussion on that?
Commissioner Pedersen. To me, they all look very similar and, give or take 20, 25 feet. Other than recreational development, what's the purpose and reasoning behind that? And that's basically cutting it in half.
Right, and that is taken from the DNR's model ordinance. So that's where that information has come from, is taking that from the DNR's model ordinance of what they are including for square footage and lot width for development. I believe it's more consistent with the current state of development and the types of lots and homes that folks are hoping to build in these areas. And again, the other thing to consider with part of that is that this is not necessarily just the shoreline properties, the properties that butt up to the actual water area. This would be any areas within 1,000 feet of that area. So being able to make things a little more flexible for development in those areas around those recreational development lakes.
Got it. Thank you.
This is Commissioner Gar again. I just think that flexibility is so important so we can preserve the beauty of our landscape and avoid cookie cutter developments.
Chair, commissioners, any additional?
Bob, I was just looking quick at the lot sizes for R1. It looks pretty consistent. It looks like it's being reduced quite a bit, but when I compare it to our R1 zoning code, it seems reasonable.
Right.
This is Terry Schwarting. What would other neighboring towns be like a Chanhassen, Chaska? How would their current ordinance differ?
I don't know that I have that information readily available, but it is definitely something that we can find out and bring back when we continue this discussion at our next meeting.
I think on some of these it would just be helpful knowing what our neighbors are doing.
Right.
It doesn't make it right or wrong, but
we can certainly pull some of that neighboring community data on these specific lot width and lot areas just for comparison's sake for our next meeting.
There was something in the paper last Sunday about Excelsior changing their ordinances. Be interesting to follow up on that as part of the communities, along with Chaska and Chanhassen.
I've got it. I've got a note to bring that to the next meeting.
Good.
And again, this is all we've got another meeting in May on May 19th that we were planning to talk through some of this stuff again prior to any public hearing. You will get to see a proposed ordinance. So really at this point in time, this is just something for you guys to noodle. So feel free to come up when you wake up in the middle of the night with your thoughts or questions, jot them down, and we can address them as we continue this process. Next slide, please. So this is another proposed change from our current ordinance that again would actually, the proposed ordinance is from the DNR model ordinance, which is actually less restrictive when it comes to the reduction in, or it comes to the ordinary high water line setbacks for the different categories of lakes. So you'll see our current ordinance has natural environment at 150 feet setback from that water level. That is also the DNR's setback. But when you look to recreational development and general development lakes, they have lower setbacks from that water line in those areas. So recreational development, the DNR model is 75 as opposed to R100, and in general development lakes, the DNR's proposed or the DNR's model ordinance is 50 feet as compared to R100 feet. This could potentially, if the commission were and council were amenable to these setbacks may reduce some of those non-conforming issues that we discussed earlier. I have not done a measurement or a calculation of those properties, but I'd have to imagine that this would likely eliminate some of those potential non-conformities.
This is Gar again. Is that what we really want, or do we want to protect and eliminate the possibility of more development closer to our water fronts?
And that is absolutely a valid discussion point for the commission. That's what we're looking for feedback on.
I'd prefer to keep it the way it is.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Commissioner Gar. I think, keeping that barrier 100 feet, just helps. Interesting to hear from our lake and water control folks, but I think we're protecting our resources by keeping, that barrier.
This is Paul. One thing to think about is lot design. And so when a person has to meet the square footage requirement, what they'll look at is see that 100-foot setback requirement, think about the front yard setback, and then the size of the house will then decide how they want to subdivide that lot and whether they make it more narrow in order to accomplish that. Or, so I mean, there's a couple permutations that get thrown into there. It's not just the setback itself, but it's how, do you want long lots, or would you prefer to have wider lots? How do you want to utilize the lake? Those sorts of things.
Perhaps we should differentiate between single-family development and multi-use development.
I'm not sure if that, in regards to protecting the lake shore and the water quality and the lake, I'm not sure the type of housing would make that much of a difference. I absolutely understand Paul's point. Is this one of those items where we sort of need to, like when we're talking about development in like the 13.5 acres, and we need a little leeway from the DNR. Is this kind of negotiating different points, if you will, with the DNR? We'll give you this, and you'll be a little more lenient with us when it comes to commercial and in the lakeshore?
Yeah. Yes, that is certainly part of the flexibility requests with the DNR, is that some of the items that we are requesting flexibility, the DNR does then expect to have some more protective standards in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is, to me, this is one of those things that, well, none of this is going to get decided tonight, obviously, but I think it's, I know myself, I think more than, the overreaching goal of all this is to protect our lakes. And, it just seems natural to me that keeping building as far away from the ordinary high water line seems like a great way to do that. That being said, I mean, we have to negotiate some points, and as we get further down the line, maybe this is one of those points. I certainly understand your thoughts on it also. So interesting.
If it pleases the commission, we have a Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting next week, Thursday, that we were planning to present this information. So we can, this can be one of the areas that we specifically highlight to get their feedback and bring back to you at your next meeting. So you've got a few more voices you can hear their thoughts on this issue.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I know myself, I'd appreciate, are there meetings broadcast similar to this? Can we watch them online?
They
replay?
will be now because we are virtual. Typically, they are not. They are just an open meeting that anyone can come and attend. But to maintain our open meeting law requirements, we will be broadcasting them at least as long as we are virtual. So the May 14th meeting will be broadcast.
That'll be great because check in on that, and I'm sure you will anyways. But it would be I think it'd be super useful for all of us if kind of a wrap up of that, and their important comments and their thoughts. Certainly we'd like to know those.
Great. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide. So we are now getting into the flexibility requests section. So again, just to differentiate, those previous sections were what was different in our current ordinance to the proposed ordinance. This would be what differs from what Victoria is potentially proposing to the DNR's model ordinance. One of those areas is a request for reduced lot size and width requirements for non-riparian sewered developments on natural environment lakes. One of the rationales for this request is we have at least a handful of natural environment lakes that are within the city's annexation area that we know are going to be prime for development, Marsh Lake being one of them. We've had some proposals for development or some tire kicking sketches in the meat cutters property along Marsh Lake. Everything that we have gotten thus far is trying to fit more within standard requirements of our zoning and or even increased density requirements like that would happen with a PUD. So one of our flexibility requests, it would be to reduce the non-riparian lots size and width in these natural environment lake areas to this 15,000 square foot and 80 feet wide area to be more consistent with our R1 zoning, to try to be more flexible for development in those areas. As you noted on that previous slide, we would still be requiring an acre property for any riparian lot on a natural environment lake. So this would be, again, one of those motivations to try and protect that shoreline, not develop up to the water in these natural environment lakes, but be able to provide a little bit more flexibility for developers on those lot sizes.
Yeah, well, again, that's a good sized lot. I mean, that, looking at single family R1, minimum lot width is 80 feet, matches that exactly. Minimum lot area is 12,000. This is 15,000. So, I mean, it seems as though it would fit in, nicely with our zoning code currently. And I think especially with these natural environment like that is a great idea, to have them set back, have that public space around them. To me, this makes sense.
Any other comments, questions?
Well, this is Commissioner Kuhn. I agree with Scott. I think it makes sense. I don't see any reason for not doing it.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. A second flexibility request that we will be or proposing to ask for the DNR is an increase from their building height allowance from 25 feet high to 35 feet. The primary motivation from staff's perspective on this item is that if we create a 25-foot building height standard for all of our shoreland areas, is we will create an enormous amount of non-conformities because our current zoning standards allow for up to 35-foot high structures. So that's essentially what we are looking for with this proposal, is to avoid those nonconformities and again be consistent with our underlying zoning.
Absolutely, agreed, especially with the previous slide in the lot size. Just makes absolute sense.
That's a logical conclusion.
Great. Next slide, please. So one of our flexibility requests for the DNR is also the when it comes to those residential PUDs. So when we talked about that residential PUD earlier, we talked about requiring the lakeshore buffer and then 25% open space. The DNR model ordinance does not require a dedicated lakeshore buffer, but it does require 50% open space for any developments that use the PUD process. We've talked about that protecting that shoreline is important to us. And we, again, trying to be able to allow for development, but also be able to protect those natural resources based on the guidelines in the areas that we've heard are important. Staff is proposing that as a trade to requiring developers to give us that 150 feet of shoreline protection, that we would reduce the total open space requirement in those developments from 50% to 25%.
So that shoreline does not count as this 25%.
That shoreline would count as part of that 25%.
Oh, I get it. So we're just trading. You're going to give us the shoreline. So, okay.
So in this scenario, it would reduce the amount of open space that would be required elsewhere on the property.
Right. Park, something like that.
Right.
So in theory, the open space would be the 150-foot buffer.
It would really depend on the total size of the property and the size of the shoreline. So for example, if we use the meat cutters property again, I do not believe that 150 feet of shoreline would take up that entire 25%. It would count towards that 25%, but they would still be required to provide some additional green and open space to get up to that 25% of the total property.
Yeah, in that situation, it's not all on the lake, I don't believe.
Why all the way down to
but
25%? I guess, is there somewhere in between 50 and 25 that would be a better mark to hit? You picked 25, is there a reason for the 25?
Nothing scientific. No, again, I think this was one of those things that staff thought, again, on a give and take to try to protect shoreline and some open space, but still be able to create a situation that a developer would be willing to come in and develop a property. I think the 50% open space, if requiring a half of a property in that PUD area, it becomes a difficult proposition. Now, again, the argument back could be that they could meet just the straight zoning requirements and not the density bonuses that would be allowed in a PUD, if that's a problem. But that's what staff was considering when we were looking at this, is that 50% of the property is a hard undertaking, I think, to be able to actually develop some of these properties around some of those lakes. And again, I think we're mostly thinking in non-developed areas at this point.
But you stated it's all lakes.
Sorry, what was that?
Well, you stated as all lakes. It's not just any one of the categories of lakes. It's all lakes.
Right, and that would use a PUD.
As we were going through this, I had referenced a graphic from a previous meeting. And once we see the graphic of how the house sits on this lot with 25% open space, that would probably take on a little different appearance. That 25% would be reasonable. Does that make sense, Scott?
It does. It does. And when I think about it, I mean, I do understand, 50% is when you think of a piece of land and coming into develop that, 50% is a big ask. I get that. I just want, I don't know what the solution is. I guess it's, go ahead.
You are looking for a compromise on it, and I don't think that's unreasonable at all. I think a compromise between the two would make sense to me also.
Yeah, and I think as part of the PUD process, again, it's one of those items that we sort of vet out. I don't know if I don't know how you would add it, but I think it's important that it's a goal or an aspiration of the city to protect where we can, especially in the case of the development sort of lakes. I know this is all lakes, but especially with development lakes, to protect that shoreline, and and what percent that ends up being. Yeah, John, I think you're right. I think if we saw it on a map, I think you'd go, oh, 25%, that's a lot. It's probably enough. I guess what shocks me is going from 50 to 25. It's kind of the sticker shock of, wow, we're cutting it in half. Is that too much? And maybe it's not. And John, your comment is well taken. I think you're right. If I saw it on a map, I'd go, that's a lot of open space.
But also, this is the requirement minimum. If there's negotiation and process, there might be opportunity to go up with the developer depending on their situation and needs. Yeah, well, and that's I guess I probably should have said that. I always have that in my head with the PUD. There's always that opportunity. That is that's a negotiation. It's a give and take. Hopefully in the end, it's the best for the developer and it's the best for the city of Victoria and the development. And these, to me, that's the beauty of a PUD. It gets vetted out during that process. Right.
Well, that's good feedback. Perhaps, and we'll have to see if we can put something together, but maybe we could, before our next meeting, just kind of randomly pick a spot on a lake somewhere and visualize what that would look like, very crudely, of course, but be able to at least have some sort of visual of what that would potentially look like in a development area.
Yeah, even the more I think about it right now, I think it's sort of sticker shock. It's just that 50 to 25, and without a, kind of something to put it in perspective. To John's point again, in most cases, 25% is still, that's a lot. That's a hunk of land in a development. So, yeah, to be decided on that one.
Good feedback.
Yeah.
Anything else on this item? All right, next slide, please. We're just about done. So I don't know that we need to spend more time on the commercial plan unit development. We talked about that earlier. This is, again, would be a flexibility request for the DNR that I imagine they will have some feedback or suggestions on that would come back to the Planning Commission to talk about at that point in time. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So this table represents in the green, it's a little hard to see, my contrast isn't the greatest with the colors, but as I mentioned, with the DNR on these flexibility requests, they are then looking in turn to have some more protective standards in different areas than what they allow in their DNR model ordinance. So these are a couple of the places where we have noted that the proposed ordinance would allow for increased protection in some different areas. So we've already talked about the natural environment riparian lot areas. Our current ordinance is that acre of square footage. They are actually at 40,000 square feet, so a little bit larger lot size, as well as the increase to the lot width on those riparian natural environment properties. Looking at an increase of lot width in the recreational development riparian areas, again, just to be consistent with our current R1 standards, which is actually higher than what the DNR's model ordinance is. Same with the non-riparian lot widths in the recreational development lake areas. The general development riparian areas, this is our proposed ordinance is what is in our current ordinance. So we were looking at maintaining those areas for riparian and non-riparian lots on general development lakes, which, as you'll recall, in Victoria, we only have two presently, Lake Minnetonka, and the second is, what's the second one, Paul?
It was Bavaria.
Bavaria. So most of those areas are fairly well developed at this point in time, but maintaining our current ordinance standards for that. And then if you want to pop to the next slide, and then we can have discussion, the kind of the big one is that 150-foot required buffer area along shoreline when using the PUD. So those were some of the items that we are looking at giving back to the DNR, saying more protective standards in return for some of the flexibility requests.
Sounds reasonable to me.
And that actually concludes our presentation. So Paul, unless I said something completely out of left field that you need to correct, feel free to have any additional discussion.
All perfectly said.
Yeah. Liar.
Well, with that, any commissioners, any other final questions or thoughts?
This is John Iverson. What is the official status at this particular point in time of the 13.5 acre project?
So currently we have two developers who have expressed interest in developing a market rate apartment complex, and then a senior with not senior with services, excuse me, a higher amenity senior rental complex in that area. We are waiting to get the results of the feasibility study that was conducted by Kimley Horn, looking at things like street alignment, stormwater management, utility extensions, phasing, that sort of thing. We are supposed to be getting that this week to review internally. That will then get presented to council for them to formally accept. And then at that point in time, we are planning to re-engage with those two developers. We've been in contact with them throughout the short part of this year. They're still interested. They're still motivated to move forward with those types of projects. But we're waiting to get some of the more scientific detail on how we can extend utilities, how we want to align streets, to allow them to actually be able to put together and submit some formal plans.
Well, it has been a complex project. And I think the of, from the, some of the previous city council meetings that, let's keep this thing moving and let's get it figured out. More important than anything else. So good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Any questions, final questions or thoughts? Well, I'll take that as a no. I would just want to take the opportunity to thank both Paul, Marty. This was a great presentation. I know it took a lot of work. Thank you for walking us through it, and any other staff that had a hand in it. Obviously, it was a great presentation, so thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we're going to move on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. Marty or Paul, since you're right there, do you have any items from the staff for miscellaneous tonight?
None from Marty.
Just to let you know that we will be having our Lakes Water Quality Advisory Committee meeting on Thursday, next Thursday, or not this Thursday, but next Thursday. I believe that starts at 6 o'clock, 6:30. And we'll be reviewing and discussing the same topic we discussed today.
Great. I look forward to that. Thanks. Commissioners, do you have any miscellaneous items? Look at those crickets again. I take that as a no. So there's no more items tonight. Before I ask for a motion to adjourn, just as in the past, please state your name when motioning or seconding. Commissioners, is there a motion to adjourn?
This is John Iverson. I make a motion to adjourn.
Christian Pedersen, second.
Wow, that's organization. We're getting this stuff figured out. Thank you both. Motion is made by Iverson, seconded by Pedersen. I'm now going to take a roll call vote. Commissioner Jarrett.
Aye.
Commissioner Jarrett. Commissioner Kuhn, I apologize. Sorry. This wasn't even that long a meeting, and I'm already getting stir crazy. Thank you, Commissioner Kuhn. Commissioner Gar.
Gar votes aye.
Commissioner Iverson.
Aye.
Commissioner Blazer.
Aye.
Commissioner Swarding.
Aye.
Commissioner Pedersen.
Aye.
Commissioner Stensland, aye. Motion carries. Thank you.